Class, race, and gender. One indication of how the press serves the privileged and the powerful is found in how it treats the underprivileged and the powerless. The news media are largely an affluent white male domain. Blacks, Latinos, Asians, women, and the poor are accorded brief mention on social occasions. The poor are most likely to receive coverage during Thanksgiving and Christmas time when some ingredients are administered for turkey dinners. The message being that there is comfort, food, and shelter, even for the most unfortunate among us. With the Reagan cutbacks in human services and the recession of 1982 and 1983, the poor, especially the new poor, became an object of media interest for a brief intermittent spans. By 1984, with hunger and homelessness as bad as ever, the media hit upon a new theme: economic recovery. Although the number of Americans living in poverty had increased from 25 million to 35 million between 1981 and 1985, the media tended to lose interest in the poor. Women account for only about 10% of persons in the news, usually appearing as celebrities or wives of celebrities, or unusual firsts: the first woman astronaut, the first woman on the Supreme Court, the first woman vice presidential candidate for a major party. But the more general battle for economic, social, and sexual equality, and for material survival and betterment that women are waging on so many fronts, are ignored or slighted. So, with blacks and other minorities who struggle for jobs, decent housing, safe neighborhoods, viable political organizations, and adequate medical care, whose cultural contributions to uh, and attempts to win fair play in sports, art, literature, entertainment, music, religion, labor, and education have received little notice from white media. The black candidate, who attracts millions of votes in presidential primaries while taking a progressive stance on issues, is likely to win unsympathetic and slighting press treatment, as did Jesse Jackson in 1984. Women, blacks, and other minorities are also drastically underrepresented as employees in the communication industry. According to the former Boston Globe editor Thomas Winship, the majority of the 1,700 daily newspapers in the United States have never employed a single black, Latino, or Asian American journalist. Barely 5% of all employed professional journalists are people of color, and most of those work for a handful of minority owned publications and radio stations. Likewise, women account for only 6.5% of all reporters. In these kinds of statistics, black, Chicano, Asian, and many other minority women are usually counted twice, as women and as minorities. The class dimensions of the women's struggle and the black struggle, and indeed the systematic class dimensions of poverty itself, are judged to be simply not a fit subject for mainstream news media. Equality is seen as a matter of individual achievement that has no collective material basis. Class has an exploitative relationship between owners and employees, and as a determinant of wealth and power, is a subject in the news media dare not touch. However, class as a designation of occupation, income, and lifestyle wins occasional recognition, with such references as middle class, low income, upper middle, professional class, white collar, or blue collar. Consider how class biases operate in how crimes are reported and in what is even defined as a crime. Press coverage focuses public attention on crimes in the streets, with scarcely any mention of crime in the suites. Downplaying such corporate crimes as briberies, embezzlement, kickback, monopolistic restraints of trade, illegal uses of public funds by private interests, occupational safety violations, unsafe consumer goods, and environmental poisonings, which are or should be crimes and which can cost the public dearly money and lives. Every year, more than 14,000 workers in the United States are killed on the job. Another 100,000 die prematurely, and 400,000 become seriously ill because of work-related conditions. Many, if not most, of these deaths and injuries occur because the greater consideration is given by management to profits and production than occupational safety and environmental standards. Yet these crimes are rarely defined in the media and reported as crimes by the news media. How the press defines and reports on crime, then, is largely determined by the class and racial background of the victim and the victimizer. Affluent victims are more likely to receive press attention than poor ones, leaving the false impression that most victims of crime are from upper and middle class backgrounds and low income lawbreakers, especially blacks, Latinos, and other minorities, are more likely to be publicized as criminals than corporate leaders whose crimes may be more serious and of a wider scope and repercussion than discrete criminals. While the press reports occasional abuses in the economic system, it treats corporate capitalism as a fostering individual initiative and inventiveness, and as being providential rather than exploitative. The contradictions of capitalism, for instance, between the need to keep wages down in order to maximize profits and the need to keep wages up in order to maintain demand, are seldom, if ever, dwelt upon in the media. The waste, duplication, stagnation, unemployment, inflation, and the anarchy of production that comes with the unplanned economy and the failure of a market economy to respond to social need rather than private greed are seldom linked to anything in the nature of capitalism. Recessions are treated as natural, albeit unfortunate, events, somewhat akin to earthquakes or droughts, caused by something innocent called hard times. Inflation and pollution are so supposedly caused by everyone, since we all have to spend and consume. One television reporter put it this way: inflation is the culprit, and in inflation, everyone is guilty. In the news media, slums are caused by people who live in them, and not by real estate speculators, fast buck developers, tax evading investors, and rent gouging landlords. Poverty is a problem of the poor who need to be taught better values and a more middle class lifestyle. While the poor are always with us, for the media, it is in the middle of class. It is the middle class to which America belongs. The middle class is implicitly virtuous because it is seen as the repository of stability and order. Thus, on CBS Evening News, anchorperson Dan Rather referred to the $17,000 to $41,000 range as the great middle class, the glue that holds society together. The press does not link poverty, instability, and disorder to the injustices and irrationalities of the capitalist system. Image politics. The press sees the established governmental leadership as essential to the maintenance of social order, and it gives more credence to public officials, corporate representatives, church leaders, and university officers than it does to protesters, taxpayers, consumers, workers, parishioners, and students. The foremost leader in the United States is the president, who is viewed as the ultimate protector of order. A systematic examination of 25 years of presidential news in the New York Times and Times Magazine, as well as 10 years of CBS broadcasts, reveals a consistent pattern of favorable coverage for the president, with sympathetic stories outnumbering critical ones, by 2 to 1. More often than not, a president's viewpoint, especially if it has no liberal slant, is transmitted by the press with no opposing set of facts. Thus, when President Reagan claimed credit for the 1982 extensions of the Voting Rights Act and for appointing more minority members and females to administrative posts and waging a more vigorous enforcement of civil rights than previous administrations, the press faithfully reported his claims without pointing out that, in fact, he had threatened to veto the Voting Rights Act and only signed it in because it was passed both houses by veto-proof majorities, and had actually cut back on minority and female appointments and on civil rights enforcement. And in 1984, when President Reagan asserted that he would never attack Social Security, most major media gave top play to his statement without noticing that in previous years he had repeatedly attacked Social Security, equating it and other entitlement programs with welfare, which he hated. In 1984, presidential election campaign revealed the media's conservative bias to those who cared to look. According to a survey by the editor and Publisher magazine, 387 daily newspapers in the United States endorsed the right-wing Republican Ronald Reagan for president. while 63 supported the Democrat Walter Mondale. And this kind of conservative editorial bias carries over news coverage, as media critic Ben Bagdikian found looking at earlier studies. Is it possible that newspapers might endorse Republicans, print conservative columnists, editorialize in favor of conservative issues, but still counterbalance this with pro-liberal bias in their news columns? In the mid-60s, I looked at current published studies of political bias in the news. There were 84 systematic studies that found significant bias. There was a very high correlation between editorial policy and news bias. Of the 84 studies of bias, 74 found pro-Republican bias in the news and papers with pro-Republican editorial policies. There were 7 instances of pro-Democratic bias in papers with pro-Democratic editorials. In only 3 of the 84 cases was the news bias opposite of the editorial position. So, where political bias in the news is to be found is overwhelmingly pro-Republican and pro-conservative. There's much talk of liberal conspiracy in the press, but the real question is how liberal electoral politics survives at all with the overwhelming opposition in conservative press. A George Washington University study of television networking, evening news, during the 1984 presidential campaign found that 5 out of 6 stories on Walter Mondale presented him in negative manner, focusing on minor mishaps and the candidate's presumed lack of appeal rather than on the issues he was raising. The conservative bias of the supposedly liberal media have feedbacked an effect on political life. As John Kenneth Galbraith noted, political conservatism benefits from the deep desire of politicians, Democrats in particular, for respectability, their need to show that they are individuals of a sound, confidence-inspiring judgment. And what is the test of respectability? It is, broadly, whether speech and action are consistent with the comfort and well-being of the people, of property and position. A radical is anyone who causes discomfort or otherwise offends such interests. Thus, in our politics, we test even liberals by their conservatism. Candidates learn that if they take a stand on controversial issues, the press is less likely to get their position across to the public than to concentrate on the controversy arising from the position taking. Suddenly, their judgment and sustainability will be called into question. So rather than the press using the coverage to fit the campaign, candidates trim their campaigns in anticipation of coverage. In the act of reporting on political life, the media actively help shape it. The media create conservative effects by slighting the issues and focusing on candidate image. Even when attention is given to issues, it is usually to conjecture on how the candidate used to help them, his image, and advance his electoral changes. Once considered an adjunct to political discussion, image now seems to be the whole point of discussion. It is not the issues we are asked to judge, but it is the nuances of presentation. The George Washington University study conducted by the media specialist Michael Robinson found no liberal bias in the campaign coverage, but rather a hollowness, a lack of content. The campaign was treated more as a horse race than a clash of programs and listed policies. Who will run? Who will be nominated? Who's ahead? How many voters will respond? Who will win? These preoccupations are supplemented with general offerings of surface events and personality trivia. Commenting on the 1986 presidential contest, Malcolm McDougall observed, with forgivable overstatement, "I saw President Ford bump his head leaving an airplane. I saw Carter playing softball in the Plains, Georgia. I saw Carter kissing Amy. I saw Carter hugging Lillian. I saw Carter in dungarees walking hand in hand through the peanut farm with Rosalind. I saw Carter going into the church, coming out of church. I saw Ford misstate the problems of Eastern Europe, and a week of people commenting about his misstatement. I saw Ford bump his head again. I saw Ford in Ohio say he was glad to be back in Iowa. I saw marching bands and hecklers and learned about the size of crowds and significance of the size of crowds. But in all the hours of high anxiety I spent watching network news, never did I hear what the candidates had to say about campaign issues. This was not news. McDougall's impressions are borne out by studies of the 1968, 1972, and 1976 campaigns, which found that newspapers devoted respectively 56%, 64%, and 61% of their presidential coverage to the personal attributes of candidates. Television gave even more emphasis to personality than it did to printed media. And in the 1976 campaign, by ratio of more than 4-1, both print broadcast media stressed personality and campaign events over issue and discussion. The media, like the major political parties themselves, treat campaigns not as opportunity to develop democratic accountability and debate issues, but solely as a competition for office. The focus is on the race itself, with little thought raised about what the race is supposed to be about, what makes it so meaningful, and why it should even be considered an exercise in democratic governance. By focusing on human interest trivia, on contest rather than content, the media make it difficult for the public to give intelligent expression to political life and to mobilize around the issues. Thus, the media have, intentionally or not, a conservative effect on political discourse. Given the short shrift are the concerns of millions of people regarding the nuclear arms escalation, Pentagon spending, tax reform, war in Central America, unemployment, and poverty. The democratic input, the great public debate about the State of the Union and its national policies, the heightening of political consciousness and information levels, all the things democratic electoral campaigns are supposed to foster are crowded off the stage by image politics. Not only during the election campaigns, but just about on every other occasion, the news media prefer surface to substance, emphasizing eye-catching visuals, the attention-catching special angle report, and the reassuring and comforting stories while slighting the deeper, more important, but politically more troublesome and more controversial themes. There is so much concentration on surface events that we often have trouble grasping the content of things. So much focus on action and personality that we fail to see the propositive goal of the action. For instance, in 1981, President Reagan dismantled major portions of the 40 years of domestic social legislation, initiated enormous tax cuts for the rich individuals and corporations, and dramatically escalated an already huge military spending program, and launched a series of Cold War confrontations against the Soviet Union. All policies of great import. However, the theme that predominated in most stories are those crucial actions was whether Reagan was winning or losing in his contests with Congress, the bureaucracy, labor, and foreign governments. Thus, monumentous political issues were reduced to catchy but trivial questions about Reagan's political scorecard, his effectivity as a leader, and his personal popularity.